Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back. This is Catholic versus Catholic, and I am Max from Red Pill Religion.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you believe, and how you came to believe what you believe.
Okay, well, I go by Max. It's not my legal name, but it's my confirmation saint's name, and it's what I prefer to use online and as a pen name. So I run and the founder of the project called Red Pill Religion, which is not specifically a Catholic project, although I am Catholic and there are other Catholics associated with it. We also hang out with Eastern Orthodox and Anglicans and people of completely different religions. And what we like to do is explore the intersection of politics, culture, and religion, because those can't be separated. And we are critics of secularism, ideological atheism, feminism, secular social justice, and we like to discuss philosophy, history, and science, mostly addressing a male audience. So that's what we do. As for how I came to believe what I believe, I am a former atheist. I was not raised in a particularly religious home up until a certain age, and then I had two different kinds of Protestantism introduced to me. Spent 1 year in a Catholic school. Came away convinced that the Bible was just incoherent nonsense and wasn't true. I came to the Catholic faith at roughly the age of 41, 42. I'm in my 50s now. After considerable investigation, once I determined that atheism did not make sense. I had begun a search through religion. I concluded that Christianity was probably where I needed to go. In my searches, I basically wanted to know who had the best claim to being the correct original Christianity, who could go back to the earliest church. And this annoys a little bit some Catholics because there's more than the Roman Catholic Church that I think can plausibly make that claim. And I came in through what's called the Pan-Orthodox movement, which looks at the various strains of Orthodox Christianity. And so what I concluded ultimately was that only the various branches of Orthodoxy could have any legitimacy at all. So I rejected sola scriptura Christianity. I rejected mostly sola fide. It depends on what you mean by sola fide. And I had only to determine from there, well, which version makes the most sense. I did conclude that there has to be something to the reality that Jesus gave the keys to Peter. I don't know if I agree as strongly as you do on the matter of how much we have to listen to the Pope, but in the final analysis, I did decide Catholicism makes most sense. Chesterton, Aquinas, the reality of what the Church did for all of what's Western civilization, despite all the calumny against it. So I became a Catholic. And I was surprised, to be honest, because, well, I knew anti-Catholic sentiment was out there. I didn't know just how virulent it was.
Can you tell me just a little bit about your childhood growing up, some of the first instances of religion that you had? Can you talk about your first impressions, please?
Without getting too into it, I grew up in a very chaotic and abusive environment. I was also part of the first very early wave of children of divorce. And divorce is always traumatic 100% of the time for everybody, especially the children. But anyway, it was at that point that religion kind of got introduced around, it was a couple years after the divorce, but around the age 8 or 9. My mother had remarried, but the marriage was already breaking down. So my stepfather figured we could fix this by becoming religious. So, they decided we were going to become Presbyterian, and all of a sudden I was thrust into Sunday school and had to go through confirmation classes. My biological dad, kind of in retaliation, said, well, no, I want to introduce you to Christianity properly, and had me on the King James Bible and Alcoholics Anonymous philosophy, and watching televangelists like Oral Roberts and Pat Robertson and folks of that strain. And I was kind of pushed really hard through Presbyterian confirmation classes. I hated it. I wanted nothing to do with it. I did have a year in a Catholic school, 1 year only. Why it was only 1 year is a long story, but 1 year only. I do remember the monks at St. Rita there made an impression on me with how smart they were. But I read the Bible. I found that I didn't like God. and I didn't like most of the stories in there, and I didn't understand why anybody believed it or why you would want to. When I hear some atheists say reading the Bible made me an atheist, I'm like, yeah, me too, because that certainly helped. I did not think much of the Bible. I did not think much of the Old Testament, which I found horribly boring and pointless. I did not think much of the New Testament because I certainly didn't think much of Jesus, who certainly seemed to be quite bizarre to me. I drifted off into exploring New Age spiritualities, some of which my grandmother and my aunt and my mother kind of got into. So yeah, as you can see, it was not a very religiously coherent upbringing. My mom and her family especially flitted from one religion to another, sometimes Christian, sometimes not. I eventually just gave it up, and I started accepting the atheist proposition that was increasingly being indoctrinated into the culture, scientific naturalism, and that whole ideology of scientific naturalism, and was an atheist. So what can I say?
So I want to zoom in on the conversion from atheism to monotheism. Can you just flesh that out as best you can?
Sure. This would have been in my early 40s. It was a number of factors, but I think the biggest one for me is I was very active on the internet. I've been working on the internet since before most people, right? I've been part of the internet culture since the 80s. And back in the early 2000s there, I was running a very popular weblog. It's not around anymore, but it used to be very popular. It was called Dean's World. And I noticed, the atheist movement coming along on the internet in the early 2000s. And I even bought into it for a little while. I was a big fan of Penn Jillette and Penn and Teller, and I kind of liked Daniel Dennett. And he started this movement called the Brights, and I called myself a Bright very briefly. I don't know if you remember that term, but yeah. What got me was I started being attacked by my fellow atheists on the internet for heresy and for thought crime. First, by saying that I thought the constant debates over creationism were more harmful than helpful, both to the atheist cause and to science. I thought the entire fight was just non-constructive. Like at the time, there was this desire to put a warning sticker on school books saying evolution is a theory. And as an atheist, I said, that's actually just true. Just let them have the sticker. You're going to make it worse. I was saying that you're going to make people hate scientists and not believe science teachers if you keep being bullies over this issue. Just let them have whatever, let them have a debate in the school and then let them go back and study biology. Well, I was viciously attacked for that and lied about, and I was attacked by atheists for other things that had nothing to do with atheism, and I began to notice what a cliquish cult movement it was. These people aren't about science, they aren't about rationality, and the viciousness with which they turned, and the emotionality that came behind them, and the fact that they would storm people and smear people for the wrong thoughts made me think, okay, you know what, I don't want to identify with this anymore. Don't even call me an atheist. Call me agnostic, call me whatever you're going to call me. I'm not an atheist, don't call me one. These people are awful. That was more than 10 years ago. And I began looking, and I began talking more and more to people who believed in God. And I talked to a lot of Orthodox Jews, got friendly with them. They were a big help in my road. I think it finally, in my searches, I just noticed through the anthropological and archaeological and evolutionary record. I don't want to argue about whether you believe in evolution or not. At the time I did. And it just struck me very profoundly that it was clear that the need for spirituality and the need to touch the ineffable and the beyond was obviously an evolved trait. Religion was obviously an evolved trait, a functional one. And you could see how people who were not religious at all actually tended to be more violent and more intolerant. And so I thought it doesn't make sense that we would evolve a need for something and a sense for something that's not real. So even though I did not fully grasp an idea of God, I thought there had to be something. And to be honest with you, I was a practicing Christian and someone who prayed on a regular basis who still didn't have a real well-formed or articulate idea of what he believed. Even after I was a Catholic, even after I came in as a Catholic, I was more like, I don't understand all this. I'm not sure I believe all this is literally true, but I will go with it. I joined a church that had certain specific teachings and values and history, and I said, I will go with it. and I will learn as best as I can. And, over time with various experiences, I learned more and more and came to understand things more and more. So the process away from atheism was actually very slow for me.
It happened in a heartbeat for me when I was reading Discourse on Method by René Descartes. When I first lost my faith at age 14, I became nice guy agnostic. That led to a sort of pantheism. And then I got into atheism once I started studying philosophy more seriously later in life. And then when I read Anselm's ontological argument, it really perplexed me. And then after 8 years of chewing on that, combined with studying philosophy and reading the Bible in an attempt to undermine it and mock it and ridicule it, everything came together when I read René Descartes, because I had fallen into solipsism, hard solipsism. I really thought that I was all there was. And René Descartes helped me out of that. I've since abandoned rationalism and René Descartes, but I'm forever grateful to him for the help that he's given me. But I want to talk about what you're excited about today.
Well, the thing that moves me most is the pan-Orthodox movement in Christianity. And it's what made me Catholic. It's still something that I am rather passionate about.
Is there a website for that? I could look it up.
I don't know if there's one that describes the whole movement, but I can tell you that the website that I studied the most that actually helped make me Catholic is called Orthodox Wiki. So if you look up orthodoxwiki.org, now that is officially run by Eastern Orthodox Christians. However, they have it is actually more of a pan-Orthodox effort in that they have representation from the Oriental Orthodox, from the Syria Church of the East, from some Roman Catholics, and it is, in terms of style, is more toward Eastern Orthodoxy, but they present the position of the Roman Catholic Church and the Assyrians and others very well, so that on various issues, so that you can see and compare them. And it was this, along with some other articles, that got me there. The people at Ancient Faith Radio and the podcasts of guys like Father Hopko, you'll notice so many of these are not Catholic sources. They were Orthodox sources. And that's because I was raised, and I heard my whole life, even when I was an atheist, I would hang out with Christians because I always had Christian friends, and I'd get invited to Bible study groups once in a while, and if I was bored, I would go. They never attracted me. But, I just heard relentlessly all of my life about all the supposed lies of the Catholic Church. And, it was an incessant thundering of lies about the Catholic Church. Well, when I studied not just the Eastern Orthodox, it wasn't even the Eastern Orthodox who fascinated me the most. It was the Oriental Orthodox and the Assyrian Orthodox. And the reason they fascinated me the most, those two fascinated me the most, is they schismed away from Rome and Constantinople both back in the 400s. The disagreements with them had started in the 300s. And, they walked away. But I, as an outsider, looked at them and said, what do they have in common? These people who walked away 1,600 years ago, let's see, they have priests that they call father, who are ordained by bishops who they say can go all the way back to Pentecost there in the book of Acts. They all take something called the Eucharist extremely seriously. They're all Trinitarian. They all affirm the eternal virginity of the Virgin Mary, her status as the Queen of Heaven, and that the saints are alive in heaven and that we can seek their intercessory prayers. They all have sacraments that they take very seriously. In other words, they all look suspiciously Catholic, despite the fact that you had 1,500, 1,600 years of separation. And all of them rejected the Protestant doctrine of sola scriptura. And I looked at all of them, and that was like it was an instant cure. I could no longer just say, well, that's a Catholic invention. That's a Catholic invention. That's a Catholic fabrication. That's a Catholic invention. All these things I could now see clearly went back to at minimum the 300s. And Jesus said the Holy Spirit would be with us and guide us aright, and he must have lied, because I could find no evidence of these Christians who just read the Bible and who rejected all these doctrines anywhere in the early church. And so I knew it had to be one of these four branches. And the differences are there, but they are so tiny. compared to almost anybody, especially in what I would call, what is sometimes called the sola scriptura tradition. Now, I don't believe in any version of sola scriptura, but the most hardcore are the ones who use the Bible and nothing but the Bible, believe in something called the sufficiency of Scripture, and it's all self-contained. Anyway, but beyond all that, I simply don't believe in sola scriptura Christianity. You're supposed to have priests, we're supposed to have sacraments. The church is a living, breathing thing that's been in ongoing operation, and there's no invisible church. The visible church has always been there, sadly divided maybe, but it actually meant a lot to me that whatever people say about Vatican II, one of the things that's happened because of Vatican II and things like it that do matter is that we've gotten, a lot closer to not just our Eastern Orthodox brothers, but like I said, the Oriental and the Assyrian Orthodox too. And I view that all as miraculous and good, and proof that the Holy Spirit is working still, and has been working along all the time. I think as a Catholic, of these other branches of Orthodoxy, is like the brother bishops have been arguing, our uncles have been arguing, but in the end, they have the faith.
I want to talk about Vatican II. In particular, I want to talk about the teaching that they reinforced, although you don't hear much about that in the context of discussions about Vatican II, but they did reassert the Catholic dogma that there is absolutely no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. But they went on to say that the Church subsists in the Catholic Church, meaning that there are elements that can save you outside of her visible boundaries. There are elements, for example, an atheist can baptize in extreme need. An atheist can baptize someone. There are undeniably elements, saving, sanctifying elements of the Catholic Church outside of her borders. So this is something that was articulated in Vatican II. The Sedevacantists really don't like that. What do you make of the dogma that there is absolutely no salvation outside of the Catholic Church, and yet we have these separated brethren even in Protestantism? How do you reconcile that, and what do you make of Vatican II generally?
Well, I joined the Vatican II Church, which is an important point I usually have to make when I'm confronted with Sedevacantists and others. The post-Vatican II catechism, that's what I assented to. I'd have to go find it. Maybe I've misread, but part of the catechism says that in some sense the whole world may be said to be within the Catholic Church. A lot of these people think they're part of the Catholic Church. When I grew up a Presbyterian, we said the creed. I believe in one God, Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Anyway, and when I was among the Calvinist Presbyterians, we always ended with that line: I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. There's lots of Protestants who say that. I think what I would have to say is that I don't think God will punish people for being wrong or confused or misled. I think that God honors his sacraments but is not bound by them. We don't ultimately know who's saved or not, only God does, but your best bet is in ancient Orthodox sacramental Christianity, and even if you're not happy with Rome right now, Rome's your best bet long term. Although when I look at a lot of the dissolution in the church today, particularly in America, I can see why some people are real unhappy right now.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about the recent scandals, particularly the sex scandals? Just talk on a personal level. How did that affect you and your faith?
In terms of the sex abuse scandal, I entered the church in my 40s, knowing already about the sex abuse scandal. I also entered it as a child sex abuse survivor who was not abused by clergy. I was abused by authority figures in the Chicago public school system, who were part of a pedo ring that also operated out of the police department and the Chicago Transit Authority, the bus and train people. Where do pedos like to go? Where they'll find kids. And sure, they can find them in a church, but they can find wayward kids that no one will notice in police stations, bus stations, train stations, school rooms. That's where they really hunt. And I had already done my research, and I already knew, this was more than 10 years ago, I already knew a Catholic priest was actually statistically less dangerous than the average man on the street, which happens to still be a fact, and more Catholics should remember it. a Catholic priest is less dangerous than the average man on the street. He's also less dangerous than a female public school teacher, statistically. And I had done a lot of men's rights work and men's issues work. You'll find me in a movie called The Red Pill by Cassie J. I know you don't want to go too much into politics, but that was kind of the politics. And I already know there is a rampant child rape problem in the public schools, in the foster homes, in the secular foster home system, in the juvenile prisons. It's off the charts how bad it is and how bad the cover-up is. And I knew all this, and I had pretty good reassurances that the church was cleaning up its problem. I already know pedos are everywhere. You find them in Boy Scout troops. You find them in anywhere. You look, they're there. I encountered them. I know how they talk. I know how they think. So this news scandals in the news has me somewhat annoyed with my fellow Catholics. I'm going to guess a lot of them, people like Taylor Marshall and Patrick Coffin, have been afraid to say anything. People like Michael Voris have been vindicated. People are talking about it now. And so a lot of Catholics, I guess, they had managed to convince themselves that the problem was behind us, and it's not. So they're still reeling from that. But I think a lot of Catholics still need to find a spine and stop and say, okay, now wait a minute. We completely agree there's a problem here, that we need these individuals torn out. But we know what the problem is, and we know where it came from. Most of the victims of priests are teenage males. It's more than 80% of them. So we have a predatory homosexuality problem. Homosexual males with a thing for teenage boys. That's what more than 80% of it is. And they've been covered up by people in the hierarchy. And it's the cover-up that's the real issue. And the cover-up that needs to be dealt with, and some people need to be defrocked. They need to be excommunicated, frankly. But all that said, it still remains. For decades now, we have known about these entryists coming in the church with the specific goal of subverting it, the specific goal of doing this. We now know that these people who came in as priests, mostly in the 60s and 70s, are in the hierarchy now. We know who they are. We don't even have at the moment a particularly bad problem with priests acting. Most of the things that we're talking about are things that happened in the 80s and 90s. And it's these old guys who are coming in for examination of it now. In the meantime, if you look, I want everybody to look for an important book called Catholic Priests Falsely Accused by David F. Pierre Jr., which you can buy that on Amazon, and there's others. We have documented proof that many priests were falsely accused and did nothing wrong and died in misery because of those false allegations. And Catholics need to start remembering that one too, especially because I can tell you what I am certain has happened in many cases. Let's say you're a priest and you're having diddlings with the altar boys, and you think maybe you're going to get caught. What's one of your best strategies? You finger an innocent man and accuse him of what you've done. This is an old trick. You see it, don't want to get political, but Marxists do it, Satanists do it, Satan does it. Okay, I accuse you of what I'm guilty of. Now all eyes are on you, and you're defending yourself. And that I know for a fact has happened to priests. We know for a fact that that's happened to priests. And so not only do Catholics need to get up and start, we do need to get this Judas element that's made it all the way up into even being bishops and cardinals in some cases. We need to confront them in a big, big way. But at the same time, we need to turn around and defend Mother Church and point the finger back at the secular element, which has a much greater child rape problem than the Catholic Church does. And we also need to say to our fellow Christians who are not Catholic to pluck the beam out of their own eyes, because if you really look at the statistics, there's corruption, including sex corruption, including child sex corruption, in every part of Christianity, including all these little non-denominational groups and Baptist groups and Methodist groups. We need to be looking at where Satan is, and Satan will be there among some of the child predators, and Satan will be there among some of the accusers, because there'll be false accusers covering for guilty people by accusing the innocent. We have to keep all that in mind.
Yeah. Have you heard of Aaron Ra?
Yes, I have in fact been highly critical of Aaron Ra.
I just interviewed him, and he was saying that, you know, there's this conspiracy to move around priests and this sort of thing. And I said, well, it's no different in any other pedophile ring. They have measures to protect themselves as well. And he just laughed. He thought that that was absolutely ridiculous. But what you said makes it sound like there might be a sophisticated mechanism in place for them to move people around, or at least to cover it up in a different way. That might be the case?
Oh, absolutely. Are you kidding? Teachers' unions are well known. The teacher who got me, you don't think he got in any trouble, do you? He got moved around. That's what happens in the public schools. They get moved around. They get moved to other school districts, or they move to other school districts. They apply for a job in another state. It's been going on for, my guy got me in the 80s. I don't know what eventually happened to him, but he never certainly had to answer for his crimes. Yes, the secular system protects pedos. To say that it doesn't, you have to have not paid attention to the pedophilia problem at all. And that's what I would say to people like Aaron Ra. He's a complete hypocrite. He has to know that the secular system covers for sex predators. Of course it does. Look at the news. We've seen the statistics. Aaron Ra is specifically an anti-Christian ideologue for pay, and has been for decades. He's a recruiter. He's a cult leader. And he makes his money spreading lies and hatred about Christianity. So I see nothing but hypocrisy coming out of him. He's part of a network that calls themselves rationalist atheists. He's hooked with other people who rationalize pedophilia, including Richard Dawkins. I can see nothing but hypocrisy coming out of Aaron Ra talking about this. He, like others who claim they care about child rape, don't. Because when I present myself to people like him and note that victims of child sex predators of the secular system are much more common than victims of priests, they laugh at me and mock me. Including people Aaron Ra knows personally have done that to me. He hasn't personally done it, but people he knows have, people in his circle. So yeah, no, I've got no respect for them because I don't believe that Aaron Ra cares about child rape at all.
Now, you seem to me to be a reasonable person and a nice guy. I mean, we've only just met. But Steve McRae, who I also thought was a very warm and sweet guy, didn't speak too highly of you. I didn't get the details, but what might it be about your conversations with him that led him to think that maybe you weren't actually a good Catholic? Because he contrasted you with one of his Catholic friends that he thought was a good, nice Catholic, and then he used you sort of as an example of what not to do as a Catholic. What's behind that, do you think?
Well, I would say that Steve McRae is a professional hate propagandist, and I've said that publicly, and I'll reiterate that he's a public hate propagandist, and he's an anti-Catholic bigot. He's also an anti-Jewish bigot, at least towards Orthodox Jews. Steve McRae has said that anybody who supports the Catholic Church supports child rape, and when I confronted him on that, and when several of my team members also tried, who were sex abuse victims, who aren't Catholic, when several of my team members confronted him on that, he was simply rude, dismissive, and nasty about it. He literally called me, a child rape survivor, a child rape apologist. He called Andrew Strutelites on our team, who's not even Catholic, who's an Anglican, and John Baptiste, who's an Eastern Orthodox Christian, called them child rape apologists too. And he will not acknowledge the reality that, I did work for years advocating for male survivors of sex abuse. The man spreads hate propaganda. And we have a long history going back with his group. If he wants to condescendingly say there are quote-unquote good Christians who don't challenge him, I would guess that's because it's Christians who don't call him on it. My friend Christopher Lansdowne at Missing the Mark had a terrible encounter with his non sequitur show a few years ago, in which McRae was quite disingenuous and condescending and nasty. His entire group, the non sequitur show, misrepresents science on a regular basis, misrepresents history on a regular basis, and is friends with people who spread anti-Christian and anti-religious hate propaganda. And they routinely muzzle anybody who calls them on it. So I have no respect for Mr. McRae. He puts on a show of being a nice person. And a lot of people in the professional atheist hate movement, and I will repeat that internet professional atheism is a hate movement. Steve McRae is part of that hate movement, and it is a cult movement as well. Aaron Ra is, Richard Carrier is, Richard Dawkins is, Matt Dillahunty is. We are critics of this movement. McRae likes to deny being an atheist, but we've had multiple people now confirm, well, if he's not an atheist, he certainly talks like one, and his hatred and contempt toward religion knows no bounds. He will be nice to your face, but I would say that with his entire group, these are people who are like Nazis, who will be nice to your face, but will say the worst, most heinous things about you. And I'm not the only one who's had that experience with those people. I think what professional con artists like that in the whole atheist movement like to do is put on a show of having a few Christian friends or a few Jewish friends who are religious or a few other friends who are religious, but then will continue to put out the most ridiculous hate propaganda. And hate propaganda is how I would call most of it. They like to claim that, anti-homosexual sentimentality comes from Christianity. It doesn't. In fact, Christians are responsible for gay rights even existing. That's just the fact. They push us all into being young earth creationists and claim that we're anti-science. They distort the history. They read the Bible, but they read it wrong, and then they criticize and condemn anybody who challenges their approach, which is always a very rudimentary, nasty approach. Steve McRae claims that he learns all kinds of great things about the Bible from a guy named John Gleason, a.k.a. the Godless Engineer, and the guy is nothing but a hate spewer who pulls things out of context. So who he associates with, who his group associates with, what they want is Christians who don't challenge them. And they will not stand up for a fair challenge on anything. So yeah, I don't get along with the non sequitur show people. Others on my team, which is quite large, feel the same way. We tried being reasonable with these people early on, but all they do is spread anti-Christian hate propaganda, and they misrepresent science and history while doing it. And so, yeah, no, he can think we're not nice. We haven't been nice. We, as a team on Red Pill Religion, took the position that being nice doesn't work anymore. And that, being nice isn't what's required for. Calling out heresy, calling out hate, calling out bullying, calling out lies for what they are what we're going to do. This disturbs some Christians, but others are our biggest fans. So,
who are your sort of comrades that aren't directly associated with you and your work that you're doing?
I guess you could say that I like Owen Benjamin, people like Michael Voris, Taylor Marshall, and Patrick Coffin. So I would say that within Catholic circles that are well known, those would be the three that I would most talk about, because I think Voris is being vindicated as we speak this year, and I think there's real issues that need to be addressed. And I was actually pleased to see that Patrick Coffin and Taylor Marshall have finally broken silence and begun talking about these concerns, because I think they're legitimate.
Yeah. What do you think of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI? What do you think of him as a man, as a pope, and now as a retired pope?
I generally think well of him. The idea of a retired pope who's still knocking around the Vatican wearing his papal regalia and living in the papal apartments is weird and disturbing, and that's one of the things that bothers me. He looks to me like he was a fairly solid Catholic who was trying to reestablish orthodoxy in the face of Vatican II. He said many things and did many things I agree with. So, I mean, I don't know. I have an overall positive view of him.
Yeah, he wanted to reform the reform.
Yeah, there's real problems with the Novus Ordo Mass. I'm coming in, I came in with the Novus Ordo Mass, but I'm actually very sympathetic with people who want to see liturgical reform going back to more traditional forms. It's really weird. Like, I guess I say I'm very sympathetic with the traditionalist Catholic movement and with many of their issues. I think some of them go too far. Some of them make sweeping generalizations they shouldn't, or they can't really back up, at least not yet. But I mean, I'm very sympathetic. I don't have the Latin Mass, but I'm very much a supporter of those who want to see it making a comeback. I came out of Protestantism and atheism, and the modern church in America quite often just reminds me of Protestantism again. And I often think, well, I came here because I wanted to be Catholic, and I'm actually pretty old school. I pray my rosary every day. I go to the Mass. I prefer not to take the Eucharist in the hand. I think a lot of the liturgical reforms after Vatican II were way too fast and caused way too much confusion. In other words, I'm broadly sympathetic with the trad Catholic revolt. Although, again, I think some would go too far.
Yeah. I did want to sort of get a feeling from you, a sense from you about how you deal on a personal level with friends or colleagues or family members who might be liberal so-called Catholics where they're pro-choice, they're pro-women's ordination, they're pro-gay marriage, and yet they go to Mass, they want to be considered Catholic even though they're in full-on rebellion. How do you deal with those sorts of people in your real life, or do you?
It's hard because you want to keep peace in the family and you don't want to just start arguments. And frankly, I used to be a liberal Catholic, which I think might be worth remembering for at least some trads. A lot of people, they wind up having these non-church attitudes. You don't want to kick them out. You want to encourage them in and to. I mean, we're all sinners and we all get things wrong. So I'm not into starting arguments with people. I'm into talking about what I think is true and telling people what I think is the truth of the faith. This is apocryphal. He didn't actually say it apparently, but it's always been attributed to St. Francis saying, preach the gospel, always use words when necessary. I try to make it clear that I support traditional Catholic teaching. And so even if you're going to depart from orthodoxy, you should at least know what it is you're departing from and why. And I guess mostly I pray for people and hopefully continue thinking and exploring, because I do think that in the end you can't mix earthly politics with the faith, and you really do have to think hard.
When I spoke with Aaron Ra, he was very, very proud of the fact that he has lots of converts from Christianity to atheism. So have you had a similar experience where you've touched someone's life and they've contacted you and said that they are religious now? Have you had any experience like that?
Quite a few. I'm not surprised when Aaron Ra gets mails like that. I used to be, I mean, I get it. Especially people who come out of some fundamentalist religion that use Bible verses to beat them up. Of course they feel liberated when somebody says, here, it's all fairy tales. Long term, most of them are going to change their mind, though. In fact, we ought to ask Aaron what the conversion rate out of his atheism looks like, because he doesn't seem to be able to hold on to a lot of those followers long term, I notice. And I have had the experience of quite a few people tell me they reverted to the Catholic faith because of me. I have one guy just recently, the one I most recently remember, I was messaging him because of the work I'm doing online. He reverted back to his Eastern Orthodox faith. A lot of people just thanking me for strengthening their faith. I get a whole lot of that. And it's because I kind of tend to focus like a laser on how irrational the atheist movement is, the atheist ideology is, and the scientific naturalist ideology. And then I kind of let people think for themselves from there. So sometimes people come to me and they say, I'm not an atheist anymore, I'm into paganism now, but thank you. And I'm like, well, hopefully you'll find Jesus on your way. It's better than that atheism, because that makes no sense at all. And yeah, we've had quite a few converts and reverts.
That's really amazing. I want to ask you, because I came to God partly through the ontological argument of St. Anselm. I really am excited by that and all the ontological proofs of the existence of God. I'm not thoroughly convinced that they're airtight, but it worked on me, even though there may be some circularity in it or some question begging in it. I don't care. You know what I mean? The prayers and meditations of St. Anselm moved me so deeply that I don't care if he's wrong about some of the logical steps he took when he's praising and worshiping God. I don't care. He's wrong about something, but his love is real. So I want you to tell me what you think the best arguments for the existence of God are for the atheist. What works best? And from another perspective, maybe it doesn't work the best on atheists because of psychology, but what do you think logically is the best argument?
You are the first person I've ever met who was convinced by Anselm's ontological argument. And I personally hate the ontological argument. It's a really weird argument to me. Although I happen to know from a philosophy professor of mine that at least 3 people have set out to disprove Anselm's ontological argument and wound up converting instead. I personally think the strongest argument right now is the argument from intelligibility. It's pretty much something that Benedict XVI forwarded. How can an orderly, intelligible universe exist without an orderly intelligence making it happen? But at the same time, what I have found over the years, because I've done because we are specifically focused on criticizing the atheist movement as one of the things that we criticize, that there is no one argument that is best for anybody. What convinces different people is different things. So the argument for motion is extremely powerful and impossible to debunk, I think, but it doesn't convince some people. Nothing convinces everybody. What I do find works is we simply focus on, most of the time, the utter illogicality and irrationality of the atheist worldview itself. The ludicrousness of the claim that it's just a lack of belief when it's anything but a lack of belief. That is what usually gets through to most people. The very fact that atheism is ultimately incoherent leads to postmodernism and actually harms science via the ideology of scientific naturalism, which is garbage. These are the things we focus on, and we do get through to a lot of people with them.
Who are some of your favorite saints, the saints that you pray to on a daily basis, that you ask for intercession? There's so many saints that I could tell you that I'm just madly in love with. First and foremost being Mary. I took her name, and at my confirmation I took the name Mary.
Oh!
And I'm consecrated via St. Louis de Montfort's consecration. I also love St. Louis de Montfort. So just gush about your favorite saints, the ones you love the most.
Maximilian Mary Kolbe, who was murdered by the godless Nazis. He was in Auschwitz ultimately for the crime of being a Catholic priest. Him first and foremost. I use his name publicly. It was my confirmation name. I was confirmed as Maximilian Mary Kolbe, and I honor him all the time. When I chose him, I didn't know much about him, and I found his fascination with the Virgin Mary odd, and I didn't quite understand it. But long story short, eventually I wound up doing the DeMont for consecration, and it changed my life. So not only Maximilian Mary Kolbe, but St. Louis de Montfort.
St. Louis Marie de Montfort.
Did he put Marie in there? I didn't know that about him. That's funny. Oh man, yeah. The first time I read True Devotion to Mary, it turned my brain upside down. I know everybody who's read that book has different reactions. People say they don't understand it. I'll just tell you, I read that book and I felt like every word of it was just poured like fire into my brain, and like I understood every word. It was a life changer. So Saint Maximilian Mary Kolbe, Saint Louis Marie de Montfort, Aquinas for obvious reasons. Definitely the Blessed Virgin Mary, who's interceded in my life more than once, and who I owe everything to, just about. I'm hers, body and soul. Saints like Joan of Arc, Saint Jerome, Saint Ambrose, Catherine of Alexandria, although some like to claim she wasn't real. I don't know. Fabulous saint. Jean-Paul the Great was a huge influence on me coming into the church. And, you know, when I pray every day, I try to remember. When I do my rosary, I try and mention every saint I can think of who was in that particular meditation.
Have you read St. Alphonsus Liguori's Glories of Mary?
No, maybe I need to.
Yeah, Alphonsus Liguori. Definitely check out the Glories of Mary. Really, really moving.
I truly believe you'll never have the fullness of the Christian faith or a full relationship with Jesus Christ unless you have a good relationship with his mother.
Yeah.
I truly believe that.
What are 3 things that I can do that will make me a better Catholic, just off the top of your head?
1, go to confession at least twice a month, whether you feel like you need to or not. Join something like the Confraternity of the Rosary and pray at least 1 rosary a week, if not more. Stand up for the church, including the falsely accused. You should do all of those things.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Did you have anything that we didn't cover that you sort of want to squeeze in before we start wrapping up?
I will mention that if any Catholics come or other Christians come to visit Red Pill Religion, do bear in mind we're not running a ministry. We do a lot of secular social commentary. We tend to be abrasive in the, as the proverb says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he think himself wise. So we tend to be pretty hard on people, and we do tend to, again, people don't get this, but we actually defend all religions. We're big advocates for religious freedom. So when we hear about Falun Gong being persecuted in China, or even Muslims being persecuted by atheist China or whatever, we speak up about all of it. Buddhists, any of it. So anyway, I guess I just wanted to make sure I got that out.
Yeah. So at the end of my interviews, I always ask my guests to give the closing thought, a little message of hope, something nice and general enough that anyone could appreciate it. What would you say to anyone that's out there listening now?
Wow, a message of hope. Well, the truth of the matter is we have ample and abundant evidence that there is a God and an afterlife. And we have ample and abundant evidence that you'll be more mentally healthy and happy if you accept this. And the reality is, I don't know if this is a message of hope for everybody, but the reality is the atheist movement is dying, and everybody knows it. I mean, Aaron Ross admitted it publicly. So has Matt Dillahunty. So has P.Z. Myers. So has Sam Harris. So have a lot of them. And for me, that's a sign of great hope because the truth of the matter is, those of you who are still atheists, you did buy into an ideological movement. That's what the atheism of all these men is. It's ideological. And once you get past that ideology and get skeptical of them, you'll find that there's a huge world of ideas out there. We like to say that on Red Pill Religion, the belief in the supernatural and the transcendent is normal, healthy, rational, and evidence-based because it is. And the world is filled with religion. If you look at the work of Dr. Rodney Stark, you're going to find out that not only is atheism and secularism declining, but all the major world religions are growing. If you open your mind to the world of spiritual and supernatural ideas, that doesn't take away any of your scientific knowledge whatsoever. It certainly didn't take mine away. It only adds to and enhances my understanding of science, which is considerable. And coming to the understanding that there is a God, it is not incompatible in any way with being an open-minded, tolerant, thoughtful, intelligent, learned person. Get to know some religious people, and who knows, maybe you'll actually become one of them.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is ask.